Okay, my name is Manfred Riem. This is Geert-Jan Wielinga, and we're going to be talking to you about MVC 1.0. Well, we're Oracle, so this is kind of what we have to do. You know, everything we say, grain of salt, bag of salt, you know, pallet of salt, whatever. Anyway, the agenda as follows. We'll be talking about what MVC is first, because I want to make sure that you guys understand what kind of viewpoint we're taking for this particular JSR, so that's number one. Number two, we're going to be talking about the JSR process itself and where we're at with it. And number three, we're going to give you guys some examples of ideas that we're having, of what we need to do, and obviously those are ideas, so we kind of want you guys' feedback on it. The reason why Geert-Jan is here, I asked him to do some demo showing MVC tooling, and if we have time, we'll have a question and answer session, and if you guys do have questions, please use the microphone. I'm not hearing well in one ear, so if you try to shout it, I won't hear it, sorry. So, what is MVC? Everybody knows the terminology MVC, but do we talk the same lingo here? To me, MVC is a pattern. It's used for UI. It consists of three major components: the model, the view, and the controller. Most commonly, when people think about the model, they tend to have a tendency to overextend what the model really is. Here, we're talking about the view model. Okay, so keep that in mind. The model itself is meant for displaying something on the view. We'll go into a little bit more detail here. So the model itself is used to store interim state, which, you know, as kind of examples here, you have, you know, who's logged in. You know, if you have a website, you want to keep track of that. That's model for the view itself. It's not model of your entire system. You can have your models, you know, other models stored into your database, but here we're kind of concentrating on within your realm of things, how is it, you know, how is it progressing, you know? And well, here's another example. Obviously, it says, what are they trying to buy? You know, if you have an application that has a sense of flow, where are you in your multi-page flow? Some people call that a wizard. The view, okay? The view in MVC, well, basically, what do you interact with? If you have a view, it's a common set of pages that, you know, a web browser displays to you. So, in my viewpoint, the view is not only just the regular response page, it is the included JavaScript, CSS, you know, or whatever else you know, happen to have on your page, like images, are the view. It's not just that single HTML page. To put it in perspective, you know, I always want to put things in perspective. So a view in a UI would basically be the entire application, right? So that's where there's kind of a big difference in, you know, in a heavy UI-based system, you generally do not switch your UI back and forth. You usually have, you know, a fixed UI, and, you know, in an embedded scenario that's really clear, you know, you have to have your UI fixed from the get-go. Okay, so we're now at you know, the controller, and that's where really the rubber meets the road for this JSR. So the controller is the workhorse of the pattern. In our case, we're just looking at it from a perspective of, let's keep the entire system, you know, very simple, very straightforward to use, and, you know, so do not over-design it, which means all the control is really at you guys. You know, so if you write your controller, you're responsible for doing all the plumbing towards the back-end systems to get your information, you know, passed through, passed back, and if you need any validation, that's also your responsibility. So that is the first step of that particular controller. Once that is done, you know, you're basically going to have to update the model that you're going to be presenting using the view. So all the models that you're using need to be populated on the basis of the responses that you've given. So, and then the next step in the process of the controller is, the controller is responsible for telling you, okay, what view am I going to display? So, you're also responsible for doing that. Okay, so because we have the EE specs here, there obviously already is another MVC out there. So I kind of want to, compare and contrast them a little bit, because there will be questions that you would ask. It's like, why are we doing this right now? Well, I'll hold that question for a little bit, but I do want to explain the difference between the two first, so that then I can actually take that explanation and show you, there is merit in the different styles. So here you have one particular style that is mentioned on the top here. It's component-based, and by raise of hands, who knows what we would mean with component-based? Okay, so who uses component-based? Okay, so who wants to use the next one, action-based? Okay, who thinks we're too late? Okay. Who thinks we're just in time? Okay. Anyway, so I'm going to go into that little bit more detail about the component-based. So as I asked, by the raise of hands, in this particular case, we're talking about JSF, obviously, from the Oracle perspective. There are other component-based frameworks out there. I want to point some of them out. You see C mentioned on there. It's been discontinued. You see Wicked on there, and you see Tapestry on there, and you see Apache Click, also retired. I think it's interesting to see that, we have a motion of frameworks going on, and I'm assuming you guys are all here because you want to know and see why the controversy is out there. But I'm looking at it perspective from, okay, in this case we have a component-based MVC, it's going to stay, okay? So, but what does a component-based MVC do? A very nice little diagram here. It tells you basically the controller is the entire framework, okay? So in a components-based architecture, you're not in control, really. The framework is in control, and you've delegated it to the framework and give the framework as much responsibility as you can, because you don't want to be in that business. You'll see that because the controller here is responsible for actually calling all the views to be rendered, and then it will basically show everything that is needed. The diagram is not a sequence diagram. It's really a diagram of where what lives. So that's really basically what we need to look at. But so how is that really different with an action-based MVC? So quite simply said, an action-based MVC really is the controller, right? I mean, an MVC per se doesn't really matter too much, because the controller is all the actions that are happening. So, I want to give you 3 examples here. You see Struts, one, a very popular one back in its day. It's end of life, right? So Struts 2, it's being used still. Obviously, everybody would probably say, if I asked for raise of hands who's using Spring MVC, I would see a large number, right? Yep, that's what I figured. Okay, so why are you guys here? You think, I saw a couple of hands being raised, for being too late. Well, do you guys know why we're doing this? I would assume that the answer to the question is no, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. Okay, so I just want to say we're doing one, and why are we doing one? Well, this is the reason why, right? You want to be in control. So the diagram here shows basically, there's a dispatcher, whether that's a servlet, filter, or whatever you want to call it. It basically calls your controllers. It has an action, and that's the controller that you wrote. That's what needs to be done. It then goes to a view. It does what it needs to do. It will tell you whatever, actually you will tell it whatever needs to be done. I should say that way. Okay, so that is, in a nutshell, the differences between, component-based and, action-based. So now on a high-level overview, I just do want to list them because they're important for where we're going with MVC. And, who likes to process their parameters themselves? I don't. Do you guys? Well, I'm okay, I have to admit, I'm doing two specs here. So I'm both on the JSF spec and the MVC spec. So from my perspective, when I see this list, there are choices to be made, right? So if I look at the left-hand side, you see manual request parameter processing. You see there's no view. There's no notion of a view really because it's not retained in memory. I'm listing here limited support for reusable behavior. That is plain and simple what normally an MVC framework has. There is really not a notion of reuse within the framework. The next one is obviously very obvious, but I want to point that out because, it's different style of working. If you look at an action-based framework, most people will say, well, I don't like the component-based framework just because I can't muck with the CSS. I can't muck with my JavaScript. So are you making the right choices here? So on the action side, you're completely responsible. Okay? So you'll also see, I listed no automatic input conversion, no automatic input validation, and the model itself, it's very request-centric. So everything has the notion of a request first. So on the right-hand side, you'll see the component-based MVC. The strengths in there, automatic request parameter processing. So you really don't need to worry about how they get into the system, how they flow out of the system. It keeps a view around. So if you're making an application that has multiple pages or multiple submissions, there is a notion of state that is already done by the framework itself. How does it do that? Well, there's a component library, and we have multiple vendors on that, obviously, and that's how you would get that particular behavior. The drawback, obviously, and everybody knows that, they are responsible for rendering the JavaScript and the HTML. So it really depends, again, what are you looking for? They do automatic input conversion and validation, but the key difference here, and that's the bottom one, it's page-centric. So it doesn't really work well if you're saying, well, I want to just map something on a request and just get a response. It's a notion of collection of pages that are your whole application. So now the hot handle, right? I did a little bit of introducing it, but okay. The MVC 1.0 JSR. What is it really? Kind of a misnomer. It really should be called action-based MVC, right? Because that's what most people would be looking for. So why are we doing this? Well, we did a survey, and you guys all responded and said, okay, we want it. So, the reason why I asked you guys to show by hands, you're too late. The survey says that you guys want it. So I think that's kind of an interesting take on it, but it's not the only reason why we're doing it. We have, as Oracle, we have our set of customers as well. We asked around with them as well, and they came back with, yeah, there is merit in it. So they think, we'll be using it for particular use cases. And that's really, the third point that I'm listing here. The UI landscape is just not one size fits all. I mean, we're talking about JavaEE here, right? But everybody knows there's also other stuff out there. There are desktop applications, and there is mobile applications. Each have their strengths and weaknesses, each have their particular frameworks and libraries. So what I just want to say, it isn't just what it is. You know, there's a lot of things out there that people can use. I do want to point out, in this particular case, our list of supporters. You can see, this is straight from our JCP page. You can see that we have Red Hat on board. We have a jug on board, another jug, and another jug on board. And you know, obviously we have some people that are, have been or are current expert group members now that you know, wanted it as well. And of course, we're supporting it as well. The reason why I want to point this out is because on this particular slide, you see that Java user groups are represented here. So the process that we're going through with this particular JSR is from the get-go, you guys need to be involved. And so anything that we want to do is, you know, obviously something that we need to validate with you. And we want feedback. So where are we at in the process? The JSR has been approved. That was done just before Java 1. So we're up and running now. We have an EG, but you know, does that mean you can't help at all? No, it doesn't. I mean, if you really are a good, you know, UI guy and you are good in an action-based MVC world, you're more than welcome to still submit your self-nomination for the EG, you know, and we'll review it and see whether or not we want you guys to join. If you think that's too much of a time commitment, because, you know, EG membership does come with a time commitment there. You know, it's not just like, okay, I'm on the EG and, you know, happy. No, we kind of, you know, we have regular email flows and you're kind of, you know, required to respond on them so that we can actually know where we're going with it. So if you think that's too much, we have a users list. So please, you know, you guys join that users list, because that's where you will see all the discussion that is happening on the EG list, because the user list gets a copy of every email that goes to the EG list, so that you guys can give us direct feedback instead of waiting, you know, at the end of the EE process, or in this case I should say the MVC process spec. We need early feedback. Don't wait. Because if you wait, we might make different choices that you might not like, you know, and we all know it's easy to just complain, but be involved. So specifically for jugs, we have an adopted JSR program. What that basically means is like, okay, as a jug, if you're really interested in helping out, we are going to look at giving you guys a small set of things that you can look at and either implement them, comment on them, test them, write documentation for it, you know, blog about it, all that kind of stuff. You know, we're wanting your guys' help on that. It's a fairly new program, you know, and it's being used, and on the other spec that I'm on, JSF, we've used it before. It takes a little bit of effort on both sides, but it is very, very rewarding on both sides, because, you know, we can see the benefits and you guys would see the benefits. So, well, what if you're not in a jog? You can still participate. Once we have a snapshot of the URI available, right now we don't because we're still discussing, but once we have it available, you can find it on ozark.java.net. And whoever guesses where we thought of the name, you know, I'll buy you a beer, but, you know, Oracle employees are not, obviously not allowed to. But please tell me, okay? Otherwise, you know, just tweet, blog, and socialize about MVC. I will be happy to respond if you have a question, even if you want to tweet it, but otherwise, you know, send email to the users list, you know, or if you're not comfortable with it, you know, send a direct message with tweeting. I'm fine with that too. Okay, so there is a part of the EG process that is rather interesting, okay? Right now in the EG we have the big question still that needs to be answered. Initially when we were thinking about filing this JSR as Oracle, we were like, okay, it's just going to be a subpart of JAX-RS. Okay, we got some early feedback, and we were told, you guys probably want to just have that as part of an EG discussion, whether or not that is warranted. Okay, so right now on the EG list, you'll see that we're actually in the middle of that discussion. The discussion of, are we going to build MVC on top of JAX-RS, or are we going to build it plain on top of Servlet? Okay, so if you have any suggestions, this is the time to speak up. Because once the decision is made, obviously we need to move forward, and then, the spec would be written in the way that the expert group thinks it's best. So, see, a critical junction point, okay? If you're not comfortable, just come to me after the session, we can talk about it directly. But why do I ask this? Why do I ask you guys to do this for us? Well, plain and simple, yes, we're on an expert group, yes, we're spec leads, but we're not perfect. And everybody knows that, right? I mean, why would we otherwise keep revving the EE specs, right? Every spec tries to do their best on common practices that were not common practices back in the day, and then we see that they become common practices and we start adopting them into the EE standard. Okay, so that's the main reason why I'm asking. So another couple of things that are being discussed, programmatic API, so that you can change the runtime behavior. I myself are a big proponent of that, because the reason being is then the actual runtime itself would use the same API, so that you can have a very easy testable framework. Remember that I said in the comparison slide, that there is no type conversion, right? Well, guess what? Our EG is discussing whether or not we should include type conversion on form inputs. So how that would be, is, actually, note that I didn't put the word automatic down there, right? I say just type conversion. So we're discussing whether or not we should include it in MVC 1.0, because that is one of the things you need to be aware of. If you're working towards a 1.0 release, it takes time, and there are things that are going to be not included. So that's why we have to have those discussions. The next one, an SPI to plug in different view technologies. You guys are probably well aware that most people, on the very popular Spring MVC side, have a couple of choices. As far as I know, there's still a lot that just use JSPs, but there are other ones out there that that they want to use. So, as part of the spec process, we're not going to standardize any of those that are mentioned here, but we're going to be looking at making sure and trying to work with whomever the project are from, and if they are willing to help us out, to actually make sure that once MVC comes around, as the implementation, that you can just plug in that view technology and get yourself up and running with that one. Because that's what it is about. It's about you guys making choices, us facilitating you. So I want to give you guys some examples of little code snippets here to show you, this is rather generic, so I wanted to show those because now I'm going to get a little bit more detailed about how the examples look like. So again, I'm putting the safe harbor statement up here for a reason. It's, it says Oracle, but let's be frank with this. This safe harbor statement could read the following. The development, release, and timing of any feature or functionality described for spec products remains the sole discretion of the EG. Okay? The reason why I want to point that out is when you're in an EG process, it's kind of a funny thing. A lot is discussed, But in the end, we have to be honest to ourselves. We have timelines. So even for an EG, a statement like that is something that you need to bear in mind. So if you see a feature that you deem absolutely essential, it is of paramount importance that enough people deem that feature essential, because then the EG will listen to that input and go forward with that, okay? Having that said, the RAV example here, it's a plain simple JSP example. The initial page, the managed bean, which is the AKA is the controller. You notice that I mentioned CDI managed bean here. That's the decision that's already been made quite early on in the process of the EG, that whatever we do, we're going to base it on CDI. We're not going to go do anything else. They're in control of the life cycle for those particular beans because it just makes sense. And then we have the result page. So now let's go into the details of it. You see, it's extremely simple example. You see a submission to a form. In the green, you see the URL that it will be submitting to. In the red, you'll see an EL expression that refers to the model. And in this particular case, because I wanted to keep the example small, the model and the controller are actually one. That's the one nice little or not nice little thing, depending on your viewpoint, that you can do within CDI. But this is basically the initial page. So you put in your input value, or you just leave the pre-populated value. You press your submit button, and then the dispatcher servlet basically looks at this. So you see that I used a @path annotation here. Again, the decision hasn't been made of why we're going to base stuff on, but for those that are aware of JAX-RS, they are keenly aware of that @path annotation. But that's the annotation that in this particular case refers to the URL that was mentioned on the previous page. So this is how you would basically register your mapping towards your controller. So as you can see, you see here form 1 has an add inject, and this is one of those things that right now that's not supported, right, in CDI. So as part of this process, and that's why it's nice to be actually at a conference. I had the opportunity to talk to the CDI spec lead, like, okay, this is really what we need. And I want to do that within the CDI realm and not having to roll up it ourselves, because it just doesn't make sense, okay? So in the entire EE world, we always will have dependency on each other. This is one of them. The simplest example here obviously uses HTTP servlet, and you see that I'm doing some manual processing and just setting the value to, something silly. But anyway, you see that I give it a return statement here of form 1B that is intended to be the one that it dispatches to. Again, this is an example, so right now I just wrote it up as string because I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a feel. We don't know. Will it be an object? Will it just be a string? Will it be a view? That's a discussion that still needs to happen. Obviously, that's how we're going. So to show the response page, extremely boring, but it still refers back to the model. That, and coming back to the original controller, the form 1B is actually what triggers the response page. So in the original list, I listed JSP and facelets, okay? So now we're going to go look at a facelet example because, well, we want to give you the opportunity to pick and choose. The reason why we chose facelets instead of any of the other ones, well, I'm on the JSF, I'm a JSF co-spec lead as well, so facelets is inside of JSF. Makes it easy, I can talk to myself. You guys didn't hear that. Anyway, so the facelet page, the only difference here, as you can tell, is one little thing that is necessary for facelets to work is JSF value instead of just value. That is just something that we would have to think about whether or not that is something we can work with. If there's anything that can be done, beyond that, it's pretty much the same example, right? So, the green one is the URL that you're going to post to. The red one is again the model that you're pulling information out of. The example itself, exactly the same thing. Form 1A. And then Form 1B is where you go to. Okay, so I do want to point something out that, as I said, I mixed the controller and the model a little bit here, because in all reality, you see the top level annotation that says named. Well, that is actually not necessary unless you're referring to it in an EL page, right? So that would be the model that you're referring to. So I personally would actually separate the two, but for brevity, I included it. So the orange part there, that would be the model, which is the value that you're getting, which is exactly what you see on the next page in red, where you see dot value. That refers back to your model, and that's how you use it. Okay, so why did we want to include facelet? Well, the previous example really is not really a fancy example, so I'll give a little bit more detailed example why we think facelets is a good way to go as an additional view technology for MVC. Facelets does templating, and it does it pretty darn well. So I'll show you the template page. Again, for brevity, I'll tell you here that you put in your CSS and your JavaScript. But the key thing to remember here is you see a UI insert. That's basically the point of insertion where you want to insert the text that you're going to be using, on the basis of multiple pages. What does this allow you? You can style your entire site the same way because it uses the same template. And obviously the example itself doesn't show it, but you can actually even have templates that are templates within templates. That really depends on your use case, but for making it simple, we're doing it this way. So coming back to your initial example, now the only difference that you see is that I wrap it in a composition that uses the template. And remember that we had an insertion point. That insertion point was called content. Now we're defining what we need to insert. And voila, we have the same page, but with our custom styling done. The managed bean, it didn't change. So let's move on that one. Okay, so the result page, the result page itself also uses in this case the composition and the template. So again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Okay, so now I want to talk about a little bit more examples. Okay, anybody that has used TextRS here? Okay. It's quite similar, right? The only difference here is that you keep seeing that add inject. So we keep coming back to the biggest question that we still need to answer. Personally, looking at this, it seems very natural to me. I wish that the add inject wasn't necessary. That's something that we might still discuss with the CDI guy, that we can have it, that header param, for instance, would be the injection point, so that's that's shorter. But having that said, you see multiple suggestions here for how do you deal with a header parameter, how do you deal with a post, how do you do path mappings, how do you deal with a session, and the last one is obviously very specific. It would allow you to do the same thing JAX-RS style does, having a mapping that is on the basis of a base URL, and then you can get whatever parameter the path was referring to. Again, you notice that the return type is still string here. Again, it's just for showing you that we're getting there. I want to look at it from a little bit of a different angle now. We've talked about MVC a whole lot, but there are other specs out there, okay? One of them is obviously the security spec, okay? That's the reason where on the top I say roles allowed. I think that, in order for a new spec to be successful, it really needs to use whatever the platform already is using, or if the platform is evolving something, it's supposed to be using it at the same time. So having that said, roles allowed is obviously an already existing one. How do we define the semantics of that? That's where an expert group comes in again. So what does it mean if a particular action method has a roles allowed and you're not in a role? What is it supposed to do? That's the kind of thing that a spec needs to define. It's really silly, but if you don't define it, then obviously you're going to get implementations that are inconsistent with each other. The next one, and this is where it becomes interesting. I just put it and called it server push. Again, not something that we have discussed yet in the expert group because it's really early, and we're going to have to discuss this really with the servlet expert group, or actually I should say the service spec leads, because that's probably a little bit easier. But what I'm trying to convey here is if you have an action method and you know ahead of time that that particular page contains a set of resources, because HTTP2 is coming down the pipe and it is going to do server push, that's what I'm looking at for support for it, so that you can just do HTTP server push in a way that is not based on the actual content of the page, because you don't know the page until you actually start processing it. But you as developer do know the page, right? I mean, you already know what kind of resources are in that page because you wrote the page. So in order for the system to be efficient, while your action method is being processed, which could take a little while, you could already start pushing down your resources, and by the time that the processing of the page itself is done, those resources would then already be available. So that's the intent of that particular annotation from the MVC perspective. Obviously, as I said, there are other specs out there. They might start looking at it as well, and that's where a lot of the coordination work needs to come into play. Okay, I want to do a little recap. Okay, so I don't think I'm doing MVC now is a bad idea, because there is so much in the platform that will make it easy to actually implement it. Yes, there are some little things here and there that need to get done, and some might say they're not little. Anyway, I really don't care. All I'm saying is, like, we're going to be leveraging CDI. We're going to be leveraging Servlet 4.0, obviously, because server push is a really nice feature. We're going to leverage facelets, and if you're using JSP, we're going to deliver you an easy migration path. It literally means in the same app, and that's the intent. In the same app, you can have your old stack, whatever that is, and put the MVC stack in there as well at the same time, and start migrating your application. I don't think that we want your experience to be, okay, I have to completely throw everything away and start from scratch. I'd rather have you guys, taking it a step at a time and have the ability to make it easier for yourself along the way. So I do want to say, well, how do you can get involved? Again, join the users mailing list, tweet about it, blog about it. But again, I like to put everything last. That is the most important, as you might have noticed. Test out snapshots, please. Early feedback in our cycle is the best way to go. Okay, so if you are scared of doing so, don't be. We're going to be writing up, and obviously MVC is going to be part of Glassfish X, whatever version we come up with. But once that happens, we're going to make sure that you guys can test it. Okay, so don't be afraid. I actually want to turn the time over to Geert-Jan now.
I think historically this is probably the earliest point in a JSR process that we're even thinking about tooling. Mm-hmm. Just to quickly go through a couple of ideas that we have, and as with anything, it's an open process, and it's as a plugin. Anyone is free to contribute their own ideas to it. Here is some basic controller code, exactly as Manfred showed, with the difference that instead of a path annotation, this does exactly the same thing. It's a different version of the early stages of the spec, request mapping. As you can see, we need to handle, as standard part of this particular spec. Is my mic okay?
Yeah.
Okay. As you can see, as is a typical part of this particular spec, we need to handle our request parameters ourselves. And we specify the incoming form, and we specify for ourselves the outgoing form. So here is a controller class, and here is that initial form with the value set, pointing back to the set value in the controller, and the response page that is specified here, you can see here. Now, a standard Maven application would have this kind of structure: web pages, source packages, dependencies, Java dependencies, project files. But with the prototype that we're working on for the tooling for this particular spec, we have one additional node in this hierarchy, and that is MVC methods. Simply because this controller class has a method that has the annotation that we're interested in, which could be a request mapping, which could be paths, or whatever ends up being the annotation. Because of that, it is listed within MVC methods. And within that, we can see the particular method that we have registered within our controller class. If we had multiple of these, so I'm now copying this and I'm going to rename it to something different, and I save this, immediately you see that the next request mapping that we've got is automatically registered here. So this gives us a logical view on our application and lets us access it very easily in the same way as you would when working with RESTful web service type applications. So if I click on this now, then the controller opens at exactly the method that I have double-clicked on. So this enables us as users of this particular spec, once it's released, to easily access the resources that relate to each other. Similarly, when I hold down the control key and I move my mouse, you can see that the return statement is hyperlinked, and from here we can jump directly into the related HTML page. So these kinds of hyperlinks and logical view extensions to the Maven project type will enable us to more easily work with this particular spec. In addition, when getting started with a new project, what's also helpful is, you can see here there is a new project type, which for its icon is actually Manfred Ream's face.
Trying to be funny.
When we go through this particular project wizard, instead of creating an empty Maven project, at the end of it, there's a final tab where the initial web page can be defined, and a response web page, and the controller class, and the mapping. And when you complete this wizard, this kind of structure is automatically created. And that's basically it. It's an MVC that works perfectly within existing IDEs, and providing these kinds of extensions to the IDEs is not much work, and simply makes working with the spec a lot easier.
Okay, so I'm putting up a links page now because I just want to show you where everything is at. But I know we have quite a bit of time left, but I want to use those for questions. Okay, so if there's any questions, please use the microphone up there. If you don't have any questions, obviously you're free to leave. But so, anyone a question?
There's a couple of people here. Maybe the front.
So what is your take on validation? Are you going to not cover
Sorry,
it
you're really going to have to speak up.
So what is your take on validation? Are you going to ignore it at all, or would you like to integrate between validation?
The question is, what is the take in the spec on validation? Would you like to integrate with bean validation or not?
Absolutely. That's actually, something that hasn't come up yet at the expert group level, but yes, obviously it's part of the EE spec, so it's available to us, so yes. How it will be triggered, that will, obviously be up to the user to actually use it. So we're going to have to figure out what the best way is to actually trigger this particular, use case.
Yes.
About the JSF thing, is it about content negotiation? And what about content negotiation?
What was the first part of your question?
About the JSF thing, is it about content negotiation? And do you think about content negotiation?
Do we think about content negotiation, and what about the JAX-RS string?
Yeah, is it linked?
Okay, well, see, that's the difference here. It's like, on an MVC side, you're not really looking at content negotiation because you already know ahead of time what the page is going to be like that you're going to go to. So if you're talking about content negotiation, there really is none. That's a different way of working where, you would send in something, but that's not a regular MVC style application. Then you're really talking about, a JAX-RS style application.
There's another question here. Yes.
Yes. Why do you need to inject on parameters instead of just inject on class fields?
Why do we need inject on parameters and not on class fields?
Well, the reason why I would want it on parameters is because if you do it on the class, then you do not have the ability to really reuse that particular class for multiple threads, because then it becomes, okay, now I need to create an instance of that class every single time a request comes in. So if you do it on a parameter, then the injection happens at the parameter point when it gets called. So it doesn't need to reconstruct everything if you structure your application in the proper way.
Okay, but CDI had methods to handle just that with the instance.
CDI has methods to handle just that with methods on the instance.
Well, I talked to the CDI guy, and he actually said that this is a valid use case that doesn't work at the moment all the way. So that's why we want to take it all the way.
A question over there.
Yeah. What are the main arguments for and against building it on top of CDI versus servlets?
What are the arguments for and against building this on top of CDI versus servlets?
You mean building on top of JAX-RS?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. The arguments, obviously, if all the plumbing, if you build on top of JAX-RS, is already there. A lot of the things that you've seen are already existing in JAX-RS. So if you don't build on top of JAX-RS, you're kind of going to have to reinvent the wheel on a lot of things. However, that means that obviously if you don't build on JAX-RS, yeah, you don't need it, but we're talking about the EE space here, so kind of doesn't hold, because in the EE space we would have JAX-RS, because we're not intending this spec to be on its own. It's part of the entire EE platform.
I think that's one of the really cool things about this spec. It's not a standalone thing out there somewhere, but it's
Right.
part of the platform, and you can leverage everything that the platform already provides.
Precisely. Yeah.
Any other questions? No. Yes.
Are you going to foresee JSF components
Sorry.
built in, or is it?
Do you foresee JSF components being built in?
In MVC?
That makes it easier.
We'll probably have to look at some alignment, but I don't think they're going to be built into MVC itself. I mean, when you saw that I referred to facelets, the facelets would be basically the view technology, but below it, it would still run a particular flavor of JSF that is capable of dealing with that. So we're going to have to, negotiate some work here, but it's not going to be a large scope of work on the JSF side to make that work.
So you can mix both.
You basically, well, what you're treating JSF as a templating language versus taking the whole life cycle that JSF has with it. So you're basically looking at it from a different angle, just saying, okay, I know that JSF has that life cycle normally, but I really don't want to use it. I just want to use it as a view templating technology and get that part of it bootstrapped. And that's the intent of it, and that. Because initially we had conversations to say, okay, can we pull facelets out of JSF? Well, that would be that scope of work would be rather large, and then you have to question the benefits of doing that versus just, okay, can we make it work with what we already have? If somebody from the community would volunteer to do all that work, you know, we're not going to say no. But then we're going to have to figure out where would it fit. You know, that's the drawback of that too. You know.
Will there be a connection to Faces flow? So
that is part of the alignment effort that we're going to be looking at. Right now, you know, you're talking about the flow scope. Yeah, the flow scope is a CDI scope, so that's at least already part of, you know, the equation that we're going to be happy with. But we're not going to have to look at how does that tie into the entire life cycle of a MVC request, and where do we need to fix or change some of the plumbing to make flow scope work in an MVC environment? Yes. Any more questions? I guess no. Okay.
Thank you very much for coming.